So go for it, Monica.
Good evening. In the SCA, I am known as Ilidor de Bedegrain, and I'm a Master of Defense. In the real world, I'm known as Monica Gaudio. I fight rapier, and I asked my very dear friend, Aaron Harper, Master Aaron Harper, also known in the real world as David Biggs, and is an amazing teacher, to come talk to us today about primarily how to have an inclusive practice and primarily how to teach people how to teach women and other people that don't look exactly like you. And the reason why I did this was twofold. One, David has been my teacher in the past, and he's absolutely been amazing and helped me and my game. He has helped me particularly when I have had issues with rebuilding my body in the past, as well as fixing my posture and my form when it was really bad. He has also had a number of women students who have gone on to become White Scarves and Masters of Defense as well. And I thought this would be an excellent time for him to come speak. I also did it, and I want to be really frank here. We have some members of our audience, primarily males, who do not tend to listen to women and as well as they do to other men. And so in part, some of this discussion is primarily for our male colleagues to hear for things that have worked with another man with their teaching and how maybe to improve their own practices in the past. And with that, I would like to just say how grateful I am to David for giving us some of his time today and talking to us about how to make a better practice. A couple of admin notes. First one is, if you have a question, please put it in the chat, and both I or Alex, who is his lovely and amazing wife, will help read them out. There are certain times where he's going to pause and we can add questions. But if you have an immediate, hey, I want to know an answer now, put that also in the chat. Also, please make sure that you are muted while you are watching this so David does not get interrupted. And again, thank you so much, David, for coming in and be willing to do this for us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Monica, and absolutely. So first note, we are being recorded. Just want to make sure everyone's aware that whatever we do and say here is going to be recorded for posterity. Let me start by saying I do not hold myself out as an expert on this. I expect that most of what I will discuss will be applicable to many disenfranchised or minority groups. But by all means, those of you who have dug into this for the LGBTQ or BIPOC communities, if I say something that gives you pause, note it and let's discuss it and see if there's a difference in the approaches here. I see as people are logging in, I've got people from SCA, I've got people from HEMA, and I've got people in Western martial arts and mixtures of all types here. So this is going to be a full discussion that hopefully will cover all of those things. I'll reference SCA a little bit. I might reference HEMA a little bit as well, but this is meant for effectively martial arts studies. So this was probably the most difficult class to sketch out that I think I've ever done. There are so many things to address and discuss, as I'm sure most of you are all too aware. Thankfully, I will point you to Kaja's book, Fear is the Mind Killer, and to great write-ups by Gia Hoover and Rachel Faye that get to a lot of complementary points that I won't go into, at least very deeply. They've got lots of really good discussions where they've also examined different aspects of this. So here's how I've decided to get at this. I asked several of my female students, what is it that I do in their experience that seems to not run women off and to help them advance and feel included in the martial training? I've compiled those thoughts into 6 kind of broad topics that I'll discuss here. I want to start most of those topics with their words, and then I'll try and expand on what I do that they're talking about. And I'm also going to pause at the end of each section to answer questions that have arisen. Let me real quick throw these links to Gia's and Rachel's papers up in our chat box, and then I'll go on. Doopy 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 doo. Gia, I hope you don't mind. Cool. All right. 6 broad topics that came up in our conversations. Number 1, I'm going to go through these real quick. I'm going to read the 6, and then I'll hit them one by one, and then I'll at the very end, once again, I'll hit the 6 just as a repetition point. Take notes if you need to. This is going to be quite a dense discussion. 1, you need to choose a time and place when the people you want to attract can attend. 2, teach structured classes with a progression of skills. 3, once you've built a relationship of trust through those structured classes, your individual instruction should address individual physical and mental stepping stones and should be based on patience and respect. 4, it helps to promote the physicality of fencing and help students with their mechanics, their strength, their cross training, etc. 5, be open to learning from your students and presenting skills in ways that bring them to understanding. Be open also to guiding them to other instructors to hear new ways of describing things. And 6, give your students opportunities to succeed and advance and reward them when they do. Lose the ego and avoid the tough love methods of teaching. So number 1, you need to start by choosing a time and place when people you want to attract can attend. This seems obvious, but like fencing, when you dig into it, there's a lot of nuance that we fail to address. So let's start with the place. You need a place to train, clearly. I find getting venues for events and for practices one of the hardest things that I can do as a martial artist. Local parks, church auditoriums, local gyms, etc. But if your only local practice is in the backyard of that guy, you know, the guy who stands really too close to all the women and sometimes drunk calls them and says inappropriate things, how welcoming is that environment? How safe is that environment? How many women are going to nope right out of that practice? So how about the local gym that has the Confederate battle flags hanging against the back wall? Is that going to be a welcoming environment for everyone that you want to attract? When you are in charge of finding the venue, talk through things with the people you want to attract or the closest you can get to those people. Figure out what a welcoming environment would be and then endeavor to present one that would bring in people and not make them feel uncomfortable. All right, so that's place. So time. Time's easy. Make sure you don't have a practice when everyone's at work, right? Done. Well, for those of you in the SCA, well, okay, even HEMA, think about if you want to attract someone from the other group, HEMA, armored fighters, whatever, but you hold your rapier practice, let's say, at the same time and day as the HEMA practice, or in the same evening that the Armoring Guild meets. How many of those people are going to show up to your rapier practice? Well, similarly, if you want to enable women and LGBTQ friends to pick up the sword and learn, but you're holding your practice at the same time as the local arts and sciences night or the sewing guild, who do you think that'll impact the most, the men or the women? To attract the broadest audience possible, you need to schedule your practice to compete with the fewest other events. And I see this a lot throughout the SCA, at least. Rapier practice is scheduled at the same time as the heavy practice or scheduled at the same time as the ANS night. If you want to make swordplay more accessible, don't make your target group have to choose between their interests. Women are rewarded by society and by their friends more for their pursuits in the arts and for service than for martial arts or sports. Most women are already preloaded with skills and knowledge in those areas, but they are not preloaded with the knowledge and skills of competitive sports. They will be rewarded much faster and see a path to improvement much easier in those more familiar endeavors. So if you make them choose between fighting and their other interests, you're making them socially disadvantaged in order to fight. Do not do this. All right? Changing the aperture a bit. If a fencing heterosexual couple has a young child, which of the two is likely to have to put their fencing aside for a while? Or maybe a single parent wants to learn to fence. Troubleshooting. Can you, the one arranging the practice, try and help set up some kind of a childcare option for those 2 hours for your practice time? Maybe one fencer's husband is willing to sit and watch 3 or 4 kids that evening every week. Something. These are just things to keep in mind. Digging a little deeper, significant others. If you want to encourage your significant other to fence, you need to be willing to provide the time and the space for them to focus solely on that with no distractions. So that may mean both giving them the ability to go to a practice for an hour or two and giving them the ability to have an hour or two at home to do their drills and to work on their footwork or to work on their thrusts. I know men who are very encouraging and excited for their spouse's defense, but when it comes down to it, they don't really think to set aside their own time to give to their spouse to do that. Alex points out that studies have shown that the point at which men think time and household duties are allocated equally is still well short of the point that they actually are allocated equally. So effectively, if you men are starting to feel like you're giving up an unfair amount of your own time and pursuits, it's probably getting close to being fair. So bear that in mind when you're balancing your time and interests with your significant other, the fairness that you need to help them pursue their endeavors while you're also pursuing yours. So maybe to rephrase this section, to be inclusive, your training needs to happen in a welcoming place when the target audience can and will attend and aren't distracted or made to choose between their interests. All right, I hope that makes sense to people. That's the end of section 1. Are there any questions I want to try and address?
None yet. That was pretty straightforward.
Awesome. All right, section 2. Teach structured classes with a progression of skills. So let me give you 3.5 quotes here from my students that kind of led me into this discussion. 1, you teach a solid, fully formed system with a method to learn it. 2, you do drills. 3, I think that often women learn combat sports in a slightly different way than men. And early on, I got a lot of correction that wasn't helpful to my level or what I was working on. Because of the structure of your classes, that didn't happen. The classes were a positive experience because everyone was working from the ground up. I didn't feel like I was being singled out and needing to be corrected by men. So that made me go back and think about exactly what it is I do. And so I'm going to try and lay out the things that I do that they were talking about. This is one of the ways that the SCA practices really fall short consistently. Most practices, I've been in the SCA and I've lived in 4 different kingdoms, are catch and release type situations where everyone is in charge of their own advancement and their instruction is some hodgepodge at best, coming from a variety of more senior or simply louder fighters that they can get to give advice. This is a horrible way for a large majority of people to learn any type of skills. Imagine learning math or history like this. You walk once a week, you go into a room, you take a test, then you grab whatever TA happens to be in there to talk about what you're not getting right. Gia's paper has a great discussion on this point, and she goes into a little more depth than I just did, but this is the whole thing that you need to think about. This is a catch and release system that doesn't work for most people. Related, taking someone under your wing and then teaching them to parry or block by hitting them over and over again can work, but again, for a very small minority of students. And I personally argue that even when that's successful, it either takes a lot longer for those fighters to learn, or it creates a fighter who doesn't fully understand fundamentals. In my experience, those fighters who learn like that, they have a number of tricks that they've learned really well and can pass those tricks on to others, but they have a hard time teaching people who don't learn like they did or who need a structured system. In the SCA specifically, if we accept the idea of the wolf versus tiger philosophy, meaning most women learn better with a structured instruction and a pathway to improvement, this dynamic creates an inequality in the upper ranks of the SCA martial pursuits. If relatively successful fighters cannot teach martial arts fundamentals and don't learn to teach in a way that most women learn, they are responsible for keeping women out of their order or their peerage or the upper levels of their fighting structure. So this is one of the things I see that really drives a lot of the women as they go through the system falling out more and more. So teaching a progression of skills that builds up reaches most people, including most of the tigers that I'll talk about a little bit more later. Both those who learn under a collaborative system, your wolves, and many of those who learn competitively, the tigers, use a training framework that builds skills incrementally in a shared class atmosphere.
David,
I start with,
I'm going to
yep.
ask you to define, because I don't think most of your audience will know what you mean by wolf versus tiger. Can you explain that?
So yeah, let me jump ahead real quick and explain that. This is, Gia puts this in her paper. I don't know if she got it from somewhere else, but let me define real quick what a wolf and a tiger is. The wolf mindset thrives in a cooperative practice, demotivated by failures, takes a long time to warm up, maybe get in the mindset, doesn't have a whole lot of childhood roughhousing or competitive sports in their background. They use emotion to release stress in order to continue, often feel guilt about beating someone else, and they like syllabus, lesson plans, tables of contents. The tiger mindset thrives in competitive practice. They're motivated by failures. They'll push themselves to work harder when they fail, for instance. They get instant adrenaline. They're ready to go all the time. They've been roughhousing or playing competitive sports their entire life. They tend to not have emotion under stress. Their win has no guilt involved in it, that they beat someone else. And they are known to just jump in and figure it out. Okay? So usually, generally, women tend to be wolves. And I would argue only some men are tigers. I know a lot of men who are some kind of mixture of the tiger and the wolf scenario. And I still say, as I'm pointing out here, even tigers learn in a structured way. I think they learn better in a structured way. It's just that they can also survive in an unstructured learning environment. That makes sense? All right.
Yeah.
So the way I teach, to describe what I mean by a structured progression of skills, if I'm teaching a 6-week class, like, one night a week for 6 weeks, I will start with the individual movements. I'll show them and drill them, correct for form and mechanics. This is the first thing that we'll do. So for instance, I'll give you a build of 7. Learn to stand in guard. Learn to extend the arm correctly. Learn to lunge. Then learn to hold the sword. Learn the hand positions. Learn the lunge variations. Learn to move around effectively with a sword in your hand and while still keeping your stance. So those are the things we'll work on the first couple of lessons. And I'll get them down. I'll get the mechanics down. I'll get them to understand what they're trying to do individually. These are also things that you can take home and practice at home as a solo drill, okay? Once those are understood, ideally there's a decent level of proficiency, we move on to employing the individual actions in paired drills. So we learn how to advance, which you just learned, but into and out of measure. So now against someone and figuring out how to move in and out against someone. Learn to constrain the opponent's blade with yours. Take your lunge that you learned and learn how to do it while constraining your opponent's blade. Learn the disengage or cavate. Then we put you together and learn the different plates from Gigante, Capoferro, basically the actions of player 1 does this and player 2 reacts this way. The third division of my classes is, as you're learning those paired drills, you're also learning the tactics. So then after they've learned those paired drills a few times and you drilled through them quite a bit, you can go back and look at them and amplify and focus on the tactics that are built into those paired drills that they didn't see the first time around. Once they've learned how to use their body, once they've learned how to interact together, you can explain how doing this makes your opponent do that, so you can use this as a tactic. So you explain how each plate they've learned, each action they've learned, demonstrates a new application of one of the fundamentals, or more than one. You can start varying those actions for each plate to show how the tactics might have to evolve. And then you can come to a place where you're making up new actions based on, hey, I saw this guy do something last week. How do we challenge that? How do we beat that action? So that's what I mean by a progression of skills. You're learning what your body needs to do. Then you're learning what your body does with someone else as you're trying to work together. Then you're learning more competitively, how do I make that person do what I want them to do? And how does our sword play interact? How does the physics interact? Each of those builds up onto the next thing. And the thing I also want to point out is, as you move up each level, go back and revisit the earlier work. I cannot tell you how many times I will repeat this. I am still working on my lunge, and I have done tens of thousands of lunges. I am still going back and making sure that my shoulder is correctly aligned. I'm still going back and making sure my knee isn't wandering in. So all those things you learn continue to be things you need to work on. You just now build onto them and build onto them and consider it like a pyramid. All right. So I make lunges, for instance, my warm up before practices. I do 50 to 100 lunges before I go to any practice. That's also me getting into the mindset of the practice so that it serves two purposes. So you might run a class like this. This was my Shotokan class back when I was studying karate. Warm up motions or stretches. Maybe build in some exercises. 15 minutes of simple or complex individual motions. So practice your lunges, practice moving in stance, practice cuts if you're doing cut and thrust, practice your guard positions, switching from one position to another. While you, the instructor, checks for mechanics and alignment and make sure that everything is looking good and they understand how it's working. Then 15 minutes of a paired drill review, and I mean review, something that they've already learned. Plate 7 in Capoferro, plate 15, while you check out their fundamentals and how they're playing against each other. Make sure that they're playing at the right measure. Make sure that their tempo is kind of working the way it should. Then you might spend 30 minutes introducing a new action or concept and building it into some demonstrative drill. So this is when you introduce, okay, well, now you've done this plate a few times, let's alter it a little bit and bring in this new action that changes the tempo or that changes the measure. So only after that, I would say possible free fighting for those ready to do so. But that's how you might structure your classes. Once you've taken them through the lesson and you've gotten up to where they understand the plates, this is how you might structure ongoing classes. Go back and revisit things and then add a new slice for 30 minutes at the end for them to play with. The key in any case here is to introduce the skills, these lessons, incrementally and build them one on the other. Also, another really important point here is learn to describe things in various ways. A simple turn in phrasing can change someone's perception. It can turn on light bulbs. Again, as Gia said in her paper, if you teach your students in exactly the same way that worked for you, then only the people who think and learn just like you are going to excel and advance. Others are going to stagnate or leave. So to reach the broadest possible audience, understand your material well enough that you can explain it in multiple ways that people not like you can understand. And this is something that you will, as an instructor, incrementally learn. You're not going to come out of the gate being able to do that, but be open to it and watch other instructors and how they explain things. Be flexible, help students who need it to work out their own descriptions or frameworks, and or encourage them to take classes with other instructors whom you respect. I'll discuss this again a little bit later. But mainly, from my point of view, learn and understand the fundamentals and how they apply in the actions. Be able to explain how something works, not just that it works. Because once you understand how it works, you can rearrange it. If someone's not getting it, you can show something else that demonstrates the same fundamental that maybe they'll understand more. So you can get at the problem from different angles once you understand the hows. All right. At the end of section 2, any questions pop up?
No, but I have a couple, and I'm not sure if I should ask them here or ask them later. So the two questions I have are, one, do you, regarding body mechanics, right? How do you handle when people have different bodies and different body mechanics than you do, right? Like my arm length is different than your arm length. My hips are different than your hips. How do you handle that as a part of training? And the second question I have is along the line, and don't feel like you have to answer this right now, like this, you may have this later. And the second question I have is along the lines of, so you are a very high level instructor. Not every SCA practice or every HEMA practice has your level of instruction. What do you say to those people that don't have 20 lesson plans that they've learned? How do we build an SCA practice for them?
Yep. Okay. I'll answer both questions. The first one. So everyone's body can work differently. However, mechanically, let me put it to you this way: if you're in a lunge, your knee needs to be over your foot and your hip needs to be aligned with your knee. Even if your hips are different than my hips, your body needs to work mechanically correctly. The secret is trying to figure out, okay, your knee points in for this reason. How do we do that? I'll throw Fern under the bus. One of my students, Fern, was lunging, and as I squatted down in front of him, what I saw was that as he lunged, his knee and his foot were aligned, but they were aligned up his center line, which meant that his hip was sticking out. So his calf was here, but his thigh was sticking out this way. Well, if you're doing this right, they're supposed to be lined up. So what's happening is as you lunge, your foot is trying to catch you on the center line because those muscles are weak and you're not used to it, especially those of us who do this hunching, typing all day thing. So he and I worked out, basically figure out how it felt for his legs to be in the right position, and then just start drilling from that. Do a whole bunch of lunges or do some muscle workouts, etc. And for the arms, as you were saying, arm length doesn't bother me much. What I'm wanting to get at is when you lunge, when you're thrusting, I don't want your shoulder to tense up. I want you to have an engaged muscle. A physical therapist can walk you through this, or I have one that walked me through this. Your shoulders can roll when they roll forward, for instance. Your shoulders aren't as attached inside the socket. So helping your students feel what it's like to extend that arm, but not jut it outside the socket is what I'm talking about from mechanics. Part of this is also learning to use the physics of the sword correctly, learning to use your body weight correctly. So that is universal. The way I teach a lunge, the way I teach cuts has to do with your body weight as much as anything else. You're not jabbing with your arm. You are placing your point, and then your body weight is bringing the point to them. This is something I have to teach in person. It's hard for me to get into here. But I have not yet seen someone's body who just works completely differently from the way I'm envisioning mechanics. You're right. There's different ways of doing things. And I'll get to some of that later. Two of my students worked on trying to figure out their own way of describing something that I describe. And so we had to work through them understanding it so that their body did it correctly. And I'll get to that. The instructor thing. I do not want people to come away from this saying, oh my God, I don't know enough to be an instructor or whatever. There are plenty of resources out there for you now to look at. First off, if you can get me, if you can hit me on a personal chat and we can talk through things. Devin Borman has a lot of good videos that you can get, some of them for free, some of them in DVD form. He also has a great instructor training, which is not cheap, but it's a great way to go teach yourself, or let him teach you how to understand the system. The Maestro's Koblenz hold a teacher instruction once a year outside of Atlanta. Lots of different things now that you can try and tap into to try and bring in more expertise for yourself and for your students, to try and grow yourself and grow your students. So that's the best I can do right now. With the growth of HEMA and the growth of the Western martial arts over the past 15 years, there's a lot out there outside the SCA as well. Now, I would caution, a lot of HEMA instructors are instructors because they've been there 3 years and no one else has. So they're all fired up and they're doing the right thing, but they also are still learning themselves. So be cautious about who you engage as another instructor. But there are plenty. Guy Windsor's books are great. Puck Curtis, if you like the Spanish stuff, Puck and Mary have written some great books on how to handle some basics of the Spanish systems. So there's a lot of resources. Does that help, Monica?
Yep.
Okay. Section 3. Now that you've gotten a class setting, now that you've helped everyone along and they understand where you're coming from, if you've done your job, then usually your students know you fairly well and will trust you more. So your individual instruction now, when they come up and ask you to help work on something or ask for a private lesson, should address individual physical and mental stepping stones, and I'm throwing that mental in there, and they should be based on observation, patience, and respect. This is the one that it's hardest for me to really, it was hardest for me to get at, because this is something to me that's obvious, but I'm told by a lot of people that other teachers don't observe. They just simply, they keep teaching the thing that they learned and trying to beat it into you, and they don't observe and try and figure out where you're coming from. So the quotes I'll throw out there, there's quite a few of them here, but I'll try and blow through them just because this is what led me to this understanding. 1, you're respectful of people's personal space and where the student is as a valid place for them to be. 2, you're observant of how people move and you make suggestions on that rather than making blanket statements. You tailor your advice to the fencer. 3, you work with students' learning styles. If someone has a hard time learning from a mirrored position, you show it from their point of view, or you find how the student best grasps and processes physical actions. 4, you can be very patient. Yay! 5, never assume that your students are just like you. 6, not everyone has to win to get better and succeed. I'm going to talk a lot about that one. And 7, man, that ego to prove that you are better in every situation can be a non-starter as a teacher. So after building that relationship and trust through the class instruction, new person, tailor your individual instruction based on what a student needs to work on and how that student approaches things. So first and foremost, respect your student's space. This is true in group lessons as well, of course. But ask before you invade their space or you lay your hands on a student for any reason. Recall also that one of the main benefits of martial training is working to overcome personal nerves, insecurities, and fears. A lot of people want to get into martial arts just to make themselves more confident, to build up their physical, to maybe it's fun, but there's a lot of confidence building as well. So remember always that individual needs aren't always the physical actions. Pay attention to where your students are mentally and physically, be patient with them, and practice active listening. If you don't know what active listening is, go look it up. Practice the active listening when they tell you what they need. You are not trying to lay your needs over them or what you think. You're trying to listen to what they want. For instance, some new students aren't comfortable hitting someone else, but they still want to learn to do this thing we do. This is not shyness. This has been built in over their lifetime, either because they've just never had roughhousing or for some other thing in their past that they just don't want to hit people. But if they still want to learn defense, then that is something they're trying to overcome. It's something they know they have to address. So you have to help them address it and then learn it just like they would have to learn a physical action. Now, it is true, a student doesn't always know what they need in order to advance in skill. But if you're teaching a student and they see or they seem or say that they are uncomfortable, then rest assured there's a reason for it. And you cannot dismiss it or ignore it just because you don't fully relate to it. You've got to figure it out or send them to someone else who can figure it out as well. I send students to other teachers who have had similar backgrounds or who have things that they can talk about as well. Happens all the time. I believe the more that your student trusts you, the better the chances you will be able to help them past humps and difficulties. So that trust, that safety is a huge thing. Again, Kaja's book talks a lot about that. Little note on Kaja's book. It is dense. If you read through, but when you read through it, you should all read through it. I would suggest, honestly, taking notes and each section, think through the notes you've taken before you go on to the next one, because it's very dense. It's hard to read through all in one sitting because it makes you think a whole lot. So in my opinion, teaching the physical skills and the actions of fencing is really the easiest part of the process. Helping students get to the point where they're able to absorb and incorporate those physical parts of the lesson are a larger share of the effort often. Be understanding and prepared to help them through those points of understanding. So on the purely physical side of individual instruction, I find when I'm working one-on-one to help people fix things, I always start with the fundamentals. So is there a problem with how close she's starting this action that's not working right? In other words, is there a measure problem? Is she pausing too long before making her counter move? Is there a tempo problem? Is the leg alignment right during that action? Is there a physics or mechanics problem? Is the arm or shoulder doing what it needs to do in order to make sure that they have constrained the sword correctly and not going to be parried off to the side? This helps me when I'm repairing an action, when I'm trying to figure out where it's not working correctly. It helps me to methodically work through the fundamentals, like a car mechanic might work through, is it an electrical problem or a gas problem? And then you can kind of trace back to what is causing the difficulty. But also, as important, it gives me a structure on which to frame the solution. So some theoretical suggestions. Hey, your attack is looking great, but you're starting that action much too close to pull it off all the time. So let's try and initiate it further from the opponent. So that is working on adjusting a measure. So she might feel like, or he might feel like, that I just can't get this right. Well, because you're starting too close, that's why. Or your lunging sequence is good, but when you lunge, your toe is pointing into their right side and your point automatically follows. So you're missing a lot to your left over and over again. So let's go back and work on the mechanics of your lunge, both getting your foot to point straight and making sure that you're focusing on that point, your sword point going straight. So that's kind of what I mean. A lot of the things that seem like they're tactical problems come back to there are the fundamental problems that you need to go back and look at. And then that can help you build up a solution to that. All right. End of section 3. Any questions that come up?
Nope.
No. Cool. All right. Onward. Hold on. Drink. And hey, for you people, I'm not drinking bourbon this time. So, got to stay clear-headed. So, part 4, promote the physicality of fencing. Help students with the mechanics, the strength, the cross-training. So, I've got 2 quotes here on this one. One of my students said, you are interested in the physicality of fencing, cross-training, injury prevention, stuff that lots of other people gloss over. And I found that focus on healthy, safe fencing to be very smart and measured. She said, this may be a me thing, not an all women thing, but I think it's a many fencers thing. I think I see this in men and women across the board. 2, I think a big part of it for me is the fact that you acknowledge that there are some biomechanical differences, but that they are differences that need adjusted approaches rather than being limitations or weaknesses, which is refreshing. So I guess I have seen people feel like this is a limitation, you know, well, because you're built this way, it's a limitation. Well, no, it's not. There's just something you need to adjust. There's an approach that you need to add on to it to make it work. And I think this is true with 99% of the people. Now, injuries notwithstanding, right? So I would actually describe this approach as I have a strong focus, as you probably caught on with by now, on structure and mechanics of body movements. It's the foundation of what I think I'm trying to get across to people. Which means that if someone's leg is angling in during a lunge, I'll help them come up with a plan to get those muscles stronger, like I mentioned earlier. I'll try and fix that, the foundation of their, what I used to call their gun platform, before fixing their timing or fixing their technique. Because if they're not doing a lunge correctly, if the lunge is messed up, moving on to the paired actions, A, isn't going to go as well as it could, and B, it could lock in poor mechanics because they may learn how to do the cavatione, but with a terrible structure. So I kind of view this as use every tool you can to make your platform and your movements correct. If the movements are wrong, everything else becomes harder to achieve, and injury is more likely. So, as I think, again, as I think Gia points out in her paper, many or even most of those who come to fencing aren't physically prepared to fence. This is really true of most martial arts. Everyone comes to this with a different training and muscle development. An instructor needs to help find the weak points and correct them to fit in with what they're trying to teach. This goes back to my framework, my structure of instruction. I'm not going to belabor that. I keep saying this, don't I? The whole structure and arm isn't doing the right thing, etc. But think about golf swings. You can hand someone a golf club and say, go hit that ball, and they probably could. but how many thousands of hours of videos are produced on getting a better golf swing? How many golf pros make a decent living teaching just that one combination of body movements? And how many times do you think Tiger Woods practiced his swing? Fencing alone probably won't adequately build the structure you need to do good fencing and to keep from getting injuries. For this, I would say think about football. How many plays in a football game requires a player to drop on the turf and do push-ups? But I bet we can all agree that football players do push-ups and bench presses regularly to help their game, to build the right muscle structure, to help them lift their opponent in front of them and run with them. Not to be that hard, though, we can focus on improving muscular systems that will make fencing so much easier for you, and it's not that much. Simple shoulder exercises, standing in the lunge position, a proper lunge position for, I don't know, for a 20-minute Mandalorian. So these things are things you can work on easily at home. They don't take much, but it helps to understand where you or your student is missing it and try and correct that. You might look at training this way. Training at home, you focus almost completely on your physical actions, on your individual physical actions. So your structure, your alignment, moving the body is one. Some simple exercises and light weights or body weight work plays into this and counts as sword training, in my personal opinion. At practice, at your local practice, it's a mix of working on the physical and the psychological, emotional. So you're doing the physical, you're trying to drill the actions, but you're trying to now do them in a drill against someone else or in a free fighting against someone else. So that brings in the psychological and the emotional that you're also now adding onto it. When you go to a tournament, there's little time or mental room for working on the physical. What you are now doing is putting yourself through this, this gauntlet where it's all psychological and emotional. Your physical had better be at least to some level that you don't have to think about it. Now, I'm also counting adrenaline management here as psychological, emotional, even though it's technically a physical incident. But that's the way I kind of view the three big parts of what we do in the SCA: train at home, go to practice, go to a tournament. The tournament for me is still a practice. It's just practicing certain things. All right. That is the end of that section. Any questions?
Still no.
Awesome. All right. Now it's time for the drawing. If I draw your name, I want you to unmute and tell me that you're here. All right. My Ukrainian police hat. All right. Charlie Denton. Charlie, are you here?
Hey, yeah, that's me.
All right. I will get you Kaja's book within the week, okay?
Sounds good, man. Hey, thank you very much.
Yep, and there's going to be a book report due, so look for it.
Coolio. My master's program finishes up in 2 weeks. I'll have plenty of time.
Awesome, awesome. All right. Okay, section 5. How are we doing? 9:20. Hey, I may actually beat time today. All right. Be open to learning from your students. Be open to presenting skills in new ways that bring your students into understanding. Be open to guiding them to other instructors to hear new ways of describing things. 3 quotes on this one. Quote 1, it helps to describe things like stance in multiple ways. Number 2, or to be receptive to how your students might word or conceive of things differently. Number 3, it's better to not assume that your female students need something to be described to them differently, but really inclusive teachers will automatically describe things like stance in multiple ways. So the first thing I'll say in this is everyone in a training style needs to lose the ego, including the instructor. Students need to understand that they're going to get hit and they need to welcome those learning moments. You are there to help each other learn, students and the teacher, even if you're a competitive learner, a tiger. You are not there to win the drill or to be the one who always gets the hit in a free fighting situation. Even an instructor needs to allow for the fact that they need to be flexible in their approach. The way they describe an action or movement can click with some, but can confuse others. Again, we're all coming from different backgrounds and different mindsets. If someone doesn't understand what you're trying to get across, it's possible that they aren't in a place to absorb that particular lesson right then. And I've had that. If I try and teach advanced tactics, my second or third lesson students aren't going to grasp it. But it's also possible that you're not explaining it in a way that makes sense in their vernacular or their viewpoint. Remember always that something that may be obvious or clear to you may require a sea change of understanding in someone else's perception to grasp it. I have as students computer engineers. I have language practitioners. I have artists. I have a whole range of things, analysts. And each one of them, I would actually say it this way, each one of them came to their vocation because their mind works in a certain way. And so it's incumbent on me to try and understand how they process information and help them understand what I'm trying to get across to them. I don't want to change the core of what I'm trying to get across. I just want to be able to describe it in different ways to help them come to that understanding. A couple of my students will listen to what I say and they'll go through the lesson, then they'll come back to me weeks later and say, okay, here's how this makes sense to us. Tell me if we're missing something. Nyvein did this, and I think she's on the line right now. I teach in my lunge, I teach it in 3 parts. And the second part, I say, bend at the waist. So for the longest time, she and another student were bending sideways. And it wasn't working, and I wasn't seeing it. I wasn't seeing that it was working that way. Well, finally, they understood it, and they came back, and Nyvein grabs at me now, and she's like, no, hinge at the hips. It's hinge at the hips. You're bringing yourself forward, hinging at the hips. So absolutely, totally vital, and I get where she's coming from. So I am not going to tell her she's wrong at all. She's absolutely right. And I need to be able to process that bend at the waist may be something I understand, but it's probably the wrong vernacular for the way that Nyvein comes at stuff. So I want to help my students formulate their own way of processing my teaching, my lessons. That helps them to process and retain the information, yes. But it also helps me in many ways. It helps me to correct them if something goes wrong, and it helps me to see things from their mindset so I'll understand them better. It helps me to develop new ways of explaining my own system, and it helps me to understand the system I'm trying to teach. The early years of this historical martial arts revival back in the early 2000s was littered with these exchanges. We would teach at different events, and all of us were junior instructors. We would all go to each other's classes, and then after the class was over, we'd talk through that thing you said, I like that, or man, that didn't work for me at all. And I think this is how a lot of us have come to a much better understanding of Gigante, Capoferro, Fabris, and all of the systems that the historical martial artists are teaching now. If you build your own system, it's similar. If you find someone who fights like you do, get in a room and talk through how you guys do things, losing the ego, and try and figure out where the fundamentals work in your system, how you express those fundamentals. A phrase that's really healthy for an instructor to say is, I don't know, let's figure it out. Far from undermining your authority, that helps you to build trust when you're willing to engage with the student on their own learning attempts. The best way to view learning swordplay is to equate it with the scientific method. Learn how the movements should work, then try them until they fail. You're going to get hit. Evaluate why they failed. Tweak your understanding that worked in the first place, go again. So just like the scientific method, when you're learning something, expect to fail at least as often as you succeed. Don't try to be the one who always wins, because that's not learning. That is simply, I don't know, panic hitting. This approach incorporates your failed attempts into your process, and it makes it okay to fail, which it absolutely is and absolutely should be for all people. So to recap, I guess, seek out different ways to teach concepts and find other instructors with whom you agree. both for yourself and to put your students in front of them. One of the core reasons I created Lord Baltimore's challenge was to bring top instructors out here that hadn't been seen out here to the East Coast and put them in front of my students and anyone else who wanted to show up. Some of my students, this is hilarious because it frustrates me sometimes, but some of my students will go to Devin's class and they'll see him teach the exact same thing I've taught a dozen times or more. And they'll come back and say, oh my God, that thing you taught, I now understand it. And I'm like, right? But it's true. Devin uses slightly different words and he has a different approach to get to the same ideas of lunging and of the dagger parry and whatever. So even though he and I tend to look alike when we fight and we approach things the same way, it's just a different way of approaching it, of coming at it, that can help your student then get a broader view of the tactic, of the technique. And corollary, put your female students in front of top female instructors, both for inspiration, but also because they've experienced similar hurdles and plateaus and have often developed their own mechanisms that will make some sense to those female students. I think that's also important, both to have I hate to say idol, but that role model to look at if they click, and also to be able to understand, yes, I've been where you've been and here's how I got past it. All right. Pause for effect or questions. And I see none. All right.
Pardon me. I am seeing some questions in chat. For this section, there was Charlie Denton asked, from a student's perspective, what are some good methods for starting those conversations about unfamiliar, unhelpful, ambiguous vernacular? And then Jenny asked about list of top female instructors in the Midwest.
Okay. Yep. Thank you. I just scrolled up. Okay, actually, let me approach Jenny's first. How do you gain consensus or buy-in to provide a structured practice versus an extended sparring session? In all honesty, Jenny, you have to do it yourself. As you know, most SCA practices are let's throw everyone on the field and get them fighting. And in fact, I've had many fights with white scarves and mods about, no, you need to put a sword in their hand and get them on the field first. I'm going to approach that in section 6. I'm going to talk quite a bit about that. But that does not help this group of people, and I argue it doesn't help anyone, honestly. And I'll get to why. But it may be, so, okay, when I was in Houston, I moved to Houston in '99. And when I went to the Houston practice, there were 3 people. I started doing drills. And I started doing them for myself, but one of my friends that was there did drills with me. Fast forward about a year, and I would go and I would stretch and I would warm up and I would grab my sword and I would line up next to the tree that I would do drills against. And I looked around and there were 30 people around at other trees waiting for me to start. The whole idea that no one wants to do drills to me is BS. If you are doing the drills and you are advancing through and you look like you know what you're doing, you can become the instructor that everyone follows. This is what I also mean by lose the ego. One of the problems I also see is the senior cadet at a practice will take umbrage if someone deigns to try and teach instead of them or beside them or whatever. That takes some working out. That is some diplomacy. Either you might start your own practice or simply work out, look, I'm doing my own thing. I've got my friend here with me. We will do our own thing. I am not going to interrupt your practice at all. The practice in Madison, when I used to go to Madison, Wisconsin practice, had 3 different groups in this arena that all practiced basically by themselves. Sometimes they would free fight together, but they were doing their own things. That might be what you have to do. Some people are going to simply show up to practice and want to fight. That's all they want to do. You're not going to be able to save everyone. But when you start drilling, when you start offering a successive ladder of progression, you will attract those people who need that for their success. I'm being yelled at. Anyway, I hope that answered that question enough. We can talk more about that offline if anyone wants to. Charlie, from a student's perspective, what are some good methods for starting those conversations about unfamiliar, unhelpful, ambiguous vernacular? Charlie, the first thing is work with teachers that you trust. You've got some good ones near you. A teacher that you feel safe around and trust should help you understand, or should understand that you're trying to get at it a certain way. Don't challenge them. As a student, don't challenge them and say you're wrong, right? But learn different tactics. Come up and say, okay, I think I get what you're coming through, but let me rephrase it. Let me see if I can put my own phrasing on it and see if that's right. And that's kind of what Nyvein did. Let me phrase this in my way and see if I can understand it better. So that might be something else that you do is with a lot of instructors, make sure you're not challenging their authority, because that's where they get into the very insecure, I'm going to lock down what I'm saying and be right because you're challenging my authority. List of top female instructors in the Midwest. I'll get back with you on that one. I know some on both coasts. I can't think right now. I'm sure I'll find some. But let me get back with that one. Remind me if I forget. The tree of 1,000 lunges. Thank you, Theron. Yes. I used to have my students do 1,000 lunges. Actually, we only got to like 850 at tops, but still, it became kind of famous in Houston. All right, last two, and then I'll move on. With those groups, how do you keep them from becoming cliquey? Yeah, it's a very, very good question. It's very tough. I don't know a good answer to that. Well, okay, here's what I have done. As the instructor, I've been very open to the other instructors. I've had a situation a couple times throughout my career that another white scarf would show up and expect to be treated well, and also would have this kind of standoffish meh. When I would teach and I would hit on things that I know that white scarf was good at, I might defer to them and I'd be like, hey, white scarf X, this is my thought. What do you think? So I would draw them into my lesson and get them to feel more comfortable that I do respect that they have some knowledge. Now, that assumes I respect their knowledge, because there are cases where that's not quite the thing. But I try to include the other instructors in those cliques so that we all can kind of come from the same place. Even if we still stay in our cliques, at least we can all respect one another's space and positions. And strength training. So I've got a video up on Tattersall DC that goes into some of the shoulder strength training that I'm showing people. That's a bit of a whole different discussion that I can get into. So if you want to remind me later, I can email you and talk more about the strength training. There's a lot of specific exercises that my PT gave me to repair my own shoulder that I think are very useful for sword training. All right, let me go on to 6. So 6, this is a biggie. Give your students opportunities to succeed and advance, and reward them when they do. And again, lose the ego. So 2 quotes on this one. Your students should win if they did the right thing. I had a lot of people teach me, and then they wouldn't let me use the stuff they taught, or they wouldn't reward me for doing it right by letting me have the kill, or they'd be so obvious about giving it to me that I was patronized. Quote number 2, that kind of negative feedback, when you feel like you're doing a good thing, when you feel like you're doing it right, tends to hit women harder than men. So in drills and free fighting against your students, you should manage the opportunities for your students to succeed. Don't patronize them. Make sure that they adequately make or take the opportunities and that they implement that technique correctly, but don't raise the stakes on them, at least not without warning them first, and have a good reason. There's an instructor, and a few people on the line right now will know who I'm talking about, who was famous in the Western martial arts for, even when he was teaching, even when he was drilling with the students, he had to be the one to win. And he bloodied more students than I've ever seen. And I mean in the middle of demonstrations. So he would show a technique and he would have his student do the technique, but then he would beat his student anyway in the middle of the demonstration. Don't do that. You need to give your students opportunities to succeed and advance in their skill and in their self-esteem. If you teach a technique and then in your next free exchange, when you're doing some free fighting, you beat them every time they attempt to use it, you are not a very good teacher. The majority of students won't internalize the action that you've taught or even try and use it again because you denied them a structured boundary in which to work on it and to play with it. When I free fight with my students, I am not usually trying to beat them. I am trying to draw something out of them. I am trying to create the opportunities for them to learn or reinforce. I'll hit them when they mess up, but I'm only playing at the level that's needed at that time to help or to push them. If I do want to work on my own skills, I'm going to tell them, I'm doing me right now. I'm not paying attention to you. I'm going to try and beat you. But in all other cases, your job as an instructor is to reinforce the skills that they need or they want to work on, or you're giving them opportunities that you know they need to advance, whether they know it or not. Know and actively promote the idea that failure is not only okay, it is a requirement to process and retain information from most people. In Kaja's book, she lays this idea out really well. I'm not going to belabor it too much, but I'll give you one statistic that she puts in there that I like. She quotes studies that show that if you succeed in 100% of your attempts, you do not retain lessons or actions very well. The best retention is when you're succeeding only 50% of the time, which means you're having to think through it. You're having to think it and process it and apply it. And so you're coming at it like the scientific method. Why did that go wrong? How do I tweak it? What do I do better? But at 50%, you risk being overwhelmed with frustration. So studies show that 75% success rate is optimal to both retain interest and build understanding or retention. Personally, I have found when I'm fencing my students, I tend to hover around a 50% win-fail rate. And that tends to make all of us pretty happy. If I'm beating them too much, then I dial back, I try and figure out what it is I'm doing that they're not understanding, and then work again. So 50% to me sounds right, but I get the whole point that if you can try a thing and fail at it 1 out of 4, it still makes you think through it again, but it helps reinforce that you're getting it right, that you're understanding what's happening. So a note on free fighting, and this gets at what we were discussing earlier from the questions. First off, I strongly, strongly recommend against students free fighting in their first weeks of training. I know of no martial art that throws new students on the free fighting mat after a lesson or 3. None. I've trained in a few, I've observed a lot more, and it doesn't happen because it's not safe and because it pounds in bad habits immediately. I could not imagine in my first year of learning karate being thrown into the kumite ring in any time in there. I could not imagine when I was working on Aikido. If those of you who've worked on Aikido, a lot of the times before you can't do anything until you've done thousands of back rolls, until you've learned how to hit the mat and roll out of it. But more importantly for us in this discussion, doing that sets the students up to fail early on. This is seen as a challenge for those who identify as tigers, but it discourages the wolves. And the majority of women identify as wolves. All right, I have a friend now. As Gia said in her paper on wolves and tigers, you feel left behind and you don't know why, and you probably assume it's your fault. Studies show that scrimmages or sparring practices should never be more than 30% of your practice time. The other 70% for optimal training is skills drills, muscular training, and general fitness, which is effectively kind of what I described earlier. Be deliberate about your win conditions. And here's where we start getting into how to make this work well. Teach your students the same idea about being very specific and deliberate in your win conditions. And here's a novel concept. Hitting the other person should probably never be your win condition. If you're free fencing and you get the hit, it is positive feedback that several things aligned in that exchange. If you did really well, or if you're an advanced fighter, then those things that aligned are probably the things you wanted to align. The Queen's Champion I won on Steora, half of my fights, I actually was able to align those things. The other half, I won by, oh my God, I need to do something really fast. And they were not set up. They were not planned. I just simply reacted. You can get a hit and you can still fail your win condition. Again, like I just said, I've won tournaments and I've been unhappy with a lot of my fights that day. Or you can succeed in your win condition, but get the hit and you don't really know why. You know, well, I got that parry, but somehow he just walked onto my blade and I'm not sure exactly what I did. But the opposite is true, which is the whole point here. You can meet your win conditions and still lose the fight, and that's okay. You can succeed and learn incrementally even as you do not win the fight. If you make individual actions, if you make, I'm going to do this action successfully, your win condition, you can focus on learning the techniques at speed under stress, but not worrying about also having to complete the action and hit your opponent. Then once you've shown, for instance, once you've shown that I can force my opponent to hit my left shoulder every time I want them to, then I've set myself up to say, okay, now I'm going to do it again, but I'm going to parry and extend my blade. And maybe that combination of two simple things gets me the hit. But what got me the hit was that I did one thing right, I did the second thing right. So I set my win conditions and that got me the hit, but the hit wasn't my win condition. Now, I want to make sure that everyone gets that. So anyone who doesn't understand what I just explained, please speak up now. Yay! All right. Going back to the importance of drilling. New skills need to be practiced hundreds of times, even for tigers. Like I said, thousands of lunges. Shuffling around, making sure you can stay in stance as you move to the left, to the right, forward, back. You need to understand how that works mechanically in your body and make it happen again and again and again and again. Every sport is that way. Before you go to a tournament, before Michael Phelps goes to a tournament, he has done thousands of laps in the pool. He has worked on speeding himself up. He has worked on getting the exact right mechanics in his body. This is how we learn things. If you're going to practice and throwing yourself in the fighting field and expecting to get better, you're missing 2/3 of your learning experience by doing that. Some students understand this idea, the wolves really understand I need to have a plan to evolve my lessons, but others may need to have some help with that idea. Here's something that has frustrated me in the past. If I teach you a technique tonight, you're not going to dominate the field with it tomorrow. More importantly, when that technique fails to have the desired effect, it doesn't mean it's a bad technique or that it doesn't work for you. It means you haven't figured it out, you haven't got it in your body. It's not part of your toolbox yet. It's just something you're looking at. I have taught things and had students go to a practice the very next day, and then the week later say, yeah, I tried that thing, it didn't work, so I'm not going to worry about that. Or another version of that. So I set up, going back to Lord Baltimore's challenge, I set up Lord Baltimore's challenge to where we had the tournaments on day 1 and then the classes on day 2. And someone who will go nameless told me I was doing it all wrong. I need to have the classes on day 1 and the tournaments on day 2. The reason I set it up the way I did is because you can do your tournaments and you can let your mind go and you can see where you failed. And then you can go into a classroom situation having very fresh information on, wow, I wasn't parrying yesterday very well. Or, wow, I was starting too close in every one of my fights. So then you can watch what instructors say, and that can reinforce the learning that you're already doing by reviewing your fight. You are not going to learn something on Saturday, try it out in a tournament on Sunday, and make it successful. That is not going to happen. If it does, it's luck. It is not technique. So drill things again and again until you understand the mechanics of it. Okay, one more analogy because we're almost at the end anyway. If the U.S. women's national team comes up with a new offensive play Do you think they're going to immediately set up a scrimmage game and go try and make it work? Probably. They're going to drill it again and again until they understand it all. Then they're going to throw it against maybe a half team play, watch it fall apart, figure out the weak point, try it again, go over and over again. That's progressive training. That is built-in failure, and that is the way it's supposed to work. All right. Into that section. Any questions come up?
David, we had one from earlier that I'm not sure we got to. How does someone new break into a group? You were kind of talking about practices with different groups of people kind of doing things in different ways.
Yeah. That's a social construct that's hard for me to get into. Some groups, clearly it's easy. Some groups it's not. I guess what I would say is simply observe and be patient and try to talk to some people. One of the problems we also have in HEMA and SCA, and I know that this is difficult on a regional basis, the people in your area may also be trying to learn and may not know where they're coming from. So on the one hand, I would say, find the person who knows the most is the instructor in the group and try and start chatting with them and get them to understand your interest. But on the other hand, that may not exist. So I don't know. That it depends that it's hard for me to approach that one because every group I've been part of in the 4 different kingdoms I've played in, it was a little bit different. Some I was able to kind of be the new bright thing there. Some I had to kind of work my way into the people who were already running the practice and who were very jealous about their practice. So it really depends. I'm happy to talk with you more, Kelly, about your particular situation, for instance. But everything, it's all context based. Rachel, yes, what she says. She often comes and says, so Rachel comes at some things from a different viewpoint than I am. She's a very good example of she's brilliant, and she and I just think of things differently. So we have to talk things out to make sure that we understand where we're both coming from. And that's where I'm trying very hard to always simply see how she's coming from it. And I think I'm learning her better, and I'm seeing how she approaches things. But yeah, totally. As for me, as long as it doesn't completely derail the fundamentals I'm trying to teach, I'm always open to someone saying, well, but I did this thing, right? All right. To recap. So again, I'm just going to go through the 6 big points here for those who want to write them down, or for just to recap what we just talked about. 1, to be inclusive, your training needs to happen in a welcoming place when your target audience can and will attend and aren't distracted or made to choose between their interests. 2, teach structured classes with a framework of skills that leads down a defined pathway. 3, once you've built a relationship of trust with those classes, individual instruction should address the individual's physical and mental stepping stones and should be based on patience and respect and observation. I'll throw in observation as well. 4, promote the physicality of fencing. Help students with the mechanics, with the strength, with the cross training. Don't overlook the fact that this is a physical thing and that you have to make muscles work a certain way to make things happen. It doesn't mean you have to make them work unnaturally. It just means that sometimes your muscles aren't where they need to be to do the fencing, to do the thing we need to do. 5, lose the insecure instructor ego response. Be open to learning from your students and presenting skills in new ways that bring them to understanding. Be open to guiding them to other instructors to hear new ways of describing things. And finally, give your students opportunities to succeed and advance and reward them when they do. Don't beat your students over and over again. Lose the ego. This is a time for you to be teaching. So one final point on that. I went to the instructor training that the Koblentzes throw. And one of the things that was made very clear to me is one of the reasons that you see that maestros, when they hit their maestro, most maestros stop competing, because in a lot of cases, to be a good maestro, you've got to teach yourself bad habits. I have to teach myself to open holes for my students to find, to come to. And that can really mess with your tournament fighting. So in many cases, it's hard to both be a really good instructor and be a really good tournament fighter. I personally am struggling with that right now. I'm trying to do both. But I can see in the classical fencing sense, in classical fencing schools, that's one of the strong reasons you see that maestros don't tend to compete in tournaments, because their training is more important to them, and it can throw off their tournament fighting. It can throw off their tournament practice. All right. That is what I got. That is the end of it. And I'm happy what we got. We got 8 more minutes. I'm happy to answer any more questions if I can. Like I said, some of them are dependent, so it's hard to get to, but I'm here if you need me. And I will stop this in 8 minutes. I'll stop the recording in 8 minutes. Was this helpful?
Hey, David, we have a question. Any good recommendations for books on biomechanics?
Oh, actually, let me punt to Wendy. Wendy, and if Isla is on, they have both been looking at biomechanics quite a lot.
Yep, I'm here.
So what do you guys think? Some good books for biomechanics, for muscle building, etc.
Wendy, go first. If she wants.
She's muted. Wendy, you're muted. I think the Supple Leopard is one that I've seen a lot of.
Yeah, that was going to be my first immediate recommendation, is Supple Leopard. And I can turn my camera on and show people what that looks like if they want. That one is great for those who don't know. The book is called Becoming a Supple Leopard. Let me see who the author is. I forgot. Let me look.
Kelly Starrett.
Kelly Starrett, yes. It's essentially an encyclopedia of biomechanics and injury recovery and prevention, and it's kind of a brick, but it's awesome. It's got lots of like photographs and diagrams, and it's broken down by like section of body and muscle group, and it's pretty powerful. It's great. What else? I know I've had others, and I'm blanking right at the moment what they were.
I'll say before Wendy jumps in, I'll say it's also a lot of good of kind of the muscle-based yoga forms I've seen are very good for fencing as well. Again, you don't have to be lifting weights. It is making those muscles do their work. Wendy?
I don't have a whole lot of book recommendations, but I was actually going to say that going to yoga and working on core strength, that core strength was probably one of the most important things that I did. And there are so many different ways to build that, kettlebells or yoga or Pilates or just anything that will build core strength, because lots of women are lacking in core strength. And if you can't hold yourself up, you can't fence.
I'll tell you the things I personally do for legs and for core, and this is basically it. For legs, I ride my bike, I do squats, and I lunge. Those are my practices. But those have complementary muscles that all of them work on, that makes my lunge better. It makes sure that my knee's going in the right place, etc. Arms, I do a lot different arm work. I use a lot of kettlebells and maces, so that's a little bit different. That's a longer discussion. But some of the arm work that I would tell you to do on my Tattersall DC YouTube channel, there's one entire video on basically here's some arm exercises to help you hold your sword out correctly, to help you get the mechanics of your shoulder right, etc. So if you want to go look there, Tattersall DC YouTube. Jenny's brain is full. Yay!
So David, it looks like we've got a couple more questions. How do you handle teaching in an SCA context when there's not a set person or instructor? SCA practices tend to be free-form, partly because one person wants to play that role every practice. So how do you handle that?
So what I would suggest, and again, this is going to be dependent on your local context, but this works. I think this would work in most contexts. Find one of the video series, like I said, from Devin or from Guy Windsor, and maybe go to your practice and announce to some of the people, hey, I'm going to start working on this thing. And when I'm ready to impart it, give me a few weeks and I'm going to come back and teach you guys what I've learned. So you can kind of become the instructor, staying 2 or 3 weeks ahead of your friends. But one of the reasons I say to do it that way, I didn't start really learning Capoferro until I started having to teach it and started having to think through it. I know that Terry and Tim tend to feel the same way. Once you've had to start teaching and formulating the way that you present stuff, you start understanding it better. So if you're watching Guy Windsor's videos, if you're watching Devin's videos, and then you have to go and teach it to 4 of your friends the next week, you're learning it even more because now you're thinking, oh, there's this question I have, and you can get on email probably to Devin or to me or to others and say, hey, can you clear this up? And so you are now in this cycle of learning where you're reinforcing the things you've learned, you're building them into your body, you're showing them to someone else, and it becomes a nice spiral of training. And then before you know it, you are the instructor that people are coming to because you now know what you're trying to work on. There is now enough information out there that you should be able to do that in most cases.
We've got another question from Chandler. In my local group, we have a lot of senior students who are eager to teach, which is great, but it often creates situations where new students can be overwhelmed by a lot of advice on one concept from several people at one time. How can we work our teaching muscles without overloading our newer students?
So that's tough. The SCA, of course, has our hierarchy that we sometimes can rely on. But let me give you, I don't know if this will answer the question or not, but I'll give you an analogy of something that happened. When I was in North Shield, I was in a white scarf circle with a bunch of the scarves, and they were talking about how they want to grab all the new students and teach them. They want to make sure they're learning the right thing. And I told them, you're doing your own students a disservice. You need to have trained your students to be able to start people out on the basics. And so they can then cycle them in, reinforce their own teaching skills while they're teaching the basics, and then hand them off to you to teach other classes. And you can start that kind of a cycle. That also allows you as an instructor to teach more advanced things and not have to continually teach the intro level stuff over and over again. If you've got a lot of people at one practice who are all wanting to be instructors, maybe you alternate. Maybe you get together, if you get along, get together and break up the lessons. Or if you teach different styles, maybe one of you says, hey, I want to teach 2 classes in a row of this style. Can you guys let me do that? And then I'll give you the platform in 2 weeks to teach what you want to teach for 2. Or one other option, something that we've been doing here, is the local practices are inviting some of us Masters of Defense to just come teach an 1.5 or 2-hour lesson that they're recording, and then they're using that for the next few weeks to try and improve themselves. So we're kind of teaching simply a 1-hour class on a subject, and then everyone works on that for a little bit. So those are maybe 2 or 3 different strategies you can try and use. And it's all going to be personality based, obviously. And like I said, there are ways to approaching even the personality by being diplomatic. Don't try and challenge someone's ego. Don't trash talk people. Do what you can. If it's not working for you, if the practice isn't working for you, I've had to do this twice now. Bring a practice back to your house and invite those people who are interested in the way you do things. Maybe you'll only have a couple of people, but have your own practice for a while until you've built up your own skills so that you're a good instructor and you can maybe open it up to more people. So that's kind of a pox on both their houses answer, but it's still I've had to do it a few times whenever I've butted heads a lot with the people in my practice and just wanted to do the thing that I was doing without having to deal with all the politics of it.
Another question from Aisha. In the class description, plateaus were mentioned. Do you have any specific advice as regards trying to work past a plateau? And maybe you can address both working past a plateau as a student and helping a student of yours work past a plateau.
Yeah, so, and this will be the last question I answer because it's now 10. Plateaus work in two ways. Okay, I'll say it this way. Plateaus are physical or mental, but almost always to me, they're mental. Physical, maybe it's that you need to work on a muscle. Your lunge isn't working well, so you need to build that up a little bit. You are shoving your arm out and tensing it up, so it's throwing things off. So that's how it might be a mechanical thing. Usually, it's much more of an emotional or a psychological plateau where something isn't clicking, something is frustrating you, something along those lines. So the two things I'll say here is, one, as I mentioned earlier, I tend to take it back to the fundamentals. I'll talk to my students. What is it that's going wrong? What is it you're seeing that's happening? And they'll lay out for me. Here's an example of a fight that I had that was terrible. And then I'll either talk them through it, or if I don't quite get it, I'll go out and I'll try and watch them. And almost always when I'm watching them, I'm watching for a fundamental. I'm watching for they're too close, a measure issue. They're not handling the tempo correctly. They're doing things at the wrong time, or the physics or the mechanics of the way they're handling their body or the sword are wrong. Those are the three fundamentals in my view and in most instructors' views. So I will try and look at what is it they're doing that's throwing them off and fix it in that way, because at some point they've gotten so tied up emotionally in it that they're not seeing it themselves, or maybe it's an advancement that they now need to learn. And then the other thing that I will do, and I have done, and this is again why I created Lord Baltimore's Challenge, or one of the reasons, put them in front of another instructor, get them another viewpoint to see the things that they're trying to learn, and that almost always has helped my students overcome some hump that they were on. They'll see, they'll watch Guy, they'll watch Devin, they'll watch Kaja, they'll watch any number, David Koblenz, Dory Koblenz. They'll watch any number of the really good fencing instructors, and they'll see something that's like, oh yeah, okay, now I understand why I wasn't getting that thing. And even if it's in some cases, even if it doesn't fix the exact plateau, it gives them a new opportunity to try new things, which then eventually ramps them back up into learning again. So it kind of gets them excited in trying new things again. All right. So one, go back to the fundamentals when you're trying to help a student fix things, and or two, present other instructors' viewpoints so that they can have another angle to look at things. And often I find that those both help. All right. You guys are great. I don't know when the recording of this will be posted. I'll put it up on the same sites that I advertised it. My cat says, I love you all and goodbye. And I'm going to turn off recording now. Hold on. Give me that. And I love seeing you all, especially the ones that I don't get to see as much.